legitimate codification, stronger connectivity, and restoration is technically robust and socially durable. And the stronger connectivity is really a very important aspect, because in such landscapes there is strong connectivity between those who manage the land and the soil. So the idea is not to integrate the knowledges, but to have some kind of parallel legitimacy, to create a dialogue between the knowledge systems and not to absorb them into one particular system. So you generate evidence in each system, you bring that evidence into the dialogue, and you translate that into some shared action. Soil science hasn't been completely absent in this space, because there has been work done over 20 years ago, particularly when the initial work was done, but lots of work, particularly from Mexico, in the area of ethnopedology, where you bring together what you might call a community soil knowledge with their ideas of names for soil and certain characteristics that they recognize in soils, and how soils are managed and so on, indicators, and we bring what we might call our institutional soil science with its more formal ways of observing soil, and we bring them together into an ethno-pedological understanding, which once again you hope is a translation of the two without assimilation of either. So the purpose is to make knowledge systems mutually intelligible while preserving authority, context, and validation standards. So while I'm not talking about ethnopedology today, ethnopedology has a strong part to play in this two-eyed soil seeing. And if we go back to the dimensions of soil security, we think that two-eyed soil seeing deepens each of these dimensions, and we recognize that indigenous knowledges are not an appendix to soil security. The changeable is seen, valued, governed, and acted upon. And so when we look at each of the dimensions, the indigenous and ethnopedological knowledge widens each dimension of soil security. We can get some information about landscape fit, productive potential, resilience. We get different ideas about colour, texture, and soil and what they might mean, erosion and so on. And when it comes to capital, we bring in the cultural value and the spiritual value of soil and landscape. And in connectivity, we bring in language and practices and the memory of those who work with the soil. And codification, there are customary conventions and rules by which this land is managed, and protocols which we can bring to bear into our idea of codification and soil security. So soil security becomes more complete when multiple knowledge traditions inform its dimensions in their own terms. Of course, where does this idea of two-eyed soil seeing, where might it apply? It obviously applies most where you've got indigenous governed contexts, where you're operating under indigenous authority, community priorities, protocols, consent, and data governance lead the work. But there are other situations like the settler colonial context, Australia being one of them, perhaps. So it becomes a bridge for plural governance. Formal soil science, indigenous, and rights and restorations must be brought into accountable relation. And we are challenged by this in Australia, but we must attempt to do this. And of course, in highly globalized developed contexts, such as in the UK and the European Union in similar settings, like where I come from in Scotland. You know, where I come from in Scotland, my family's been there for 3,000 years. It becomes an ethical and methodological test to try and recover place knowledge from these populations and try to build that knowledge in. So there is knowledge in all populations. It's generally less traditional knowledge. So the one on the left is the most traditional to probably less traditional knowledge, but there is knowledge there. So I think what I'm trying to say, while two-eyed soil seeing applies most to the indigenous governed context, it's not geographically narrow. It does provide some insight to all situations, and it's worth considering in all situations. If we think about the dimensions such as capital, we know when we evaluate soil capital that we evaluate the natural capital and the economic capital, but this suggests to us that we should also evaluate the cultural relational capital that is brought by language and memory and authority and knowledge. So that has value, and it's how to put value on that we need to consider adding that capital. So, and in terms of connectivity, obviously indigenous lands have got a very strong connectivity with soil, and it brings adds much to the connectivity. People understand their soil functions and threats. They might not understand them in the same language that we use, but they understand what they do. They do have direct participation in looking after the soil, not in the same way that we do it, but they observe. There's a relational approach using language and memory, an intergenerational responsibility, and there is an institutional connectivity towards stewardship. So here the metrics must be codifying context aware and governed by the communities whose relationships they describe. So I think of all the dimensions, when we consider the two-eyed soil seeing approach, it strengthens this dimension the most, I believe. Then when it comes to codification, governance if you like, we need to consider that soil information may not be neutral when we concern indigenous knowledge. So we need to consider how to frame problems, recognise indigenous authority, seek consent, have a different kind of data governance or the kind of information, and have a strong accountability beyond just data extraction and so on. So we do need an aligned data governance, collective benefit, responsibility and ethics. So there's a lot that gets added to the governance in this case. If we're doing research in such areas, we need to consider consultation, participation by community members. So in consultation we need to find out, and we're considering research, what sort of research questions we need to consider. Participation of community members in all of the work, the co-production of the problem framing and interpretation, and understanding that the research itself may as well covered by indigenous authorities who might define the protocols and so on. So that's most appropriate where research contains indigenous lands, knowledge, samples, maps, data, and governance. So if we wanted to go about to do two-eyed soil seeing, and particularly in the indigenous context, we would have some steps. We'd identify authority and relationships. We'd establish consent and governance. We'd co-define the soil security concerns. I think that's very important. Develop these parallel evidence streams. It's like soil physics and soil chemistry, really. They're parallel evidence streams. They don't talk to each other, they're just going to flow in parallel. Interpret together without forced assimilation, translate into codification and connectivity, and maintain accountability and adaptive revision. So if we do those things, what will happen is capacity and condition, remember those biophysical dimensions, will gain plural indicators, or indicators that come from our soil knowledge, and our indicators that come from this indigenous knowledge, and we put them both together. Capital gains come from those cultural and relational values that we don't normally see. Connectivity gains, relationship values and stewardship, and codification requires to be added to it consent and sovereignty. And when we come to policy and restoration, soil regeneration and repair is both scientific and technical and relational. So policy frameworks should recognise indigenous governance and require consent, protect sensitive soil and landscape data. Restoration programs should combine community-defined signs of decline and recovery with the right indicators and modelling. So the outcome is a scientifically and technically robust, but also socially legitimate and institutionally durable soil stewardship, which is what we're trying to achieve. So, in the end, we want to see with both eyes. So securing soil requires more than measuring degradation. It requires transforming the relationships through which soil is known, valued, governed, and restored. And we're adding scientific and technical excellence with consent, reciprocity, plural evidence, and accountability. So we're putting these together. So that's basically all I wanted to say about this. I hope it's of some interest. If you want to hear more about soil security, health, and these kind of issues, we will be having a conference next year in Cordoba, in Andalusia. Next June, we're having our 6th Global Soil Security Conference, and we welcome you there. Come and give a talk, and that's it from me. Thank you very much.